Hi, I'm Neil, and you're listening to the Whalar Podcast, a series where we sit down for a fireside chat with luminaries from the creative industry to learn how they got to where they are, how they feel about the current advertising landscape, and what keeps them up at night. In this episode, I'm joined by Sir John Hegarty, the creative legend and co-founder of BBH, who's been central to the advertising scene for more than 6 decades. John's picked up more advertising awards than I can count. He was inducted into the American Advertising Federation Hall of Fame, and he was the first recipient of the Lion of St. Mark Award. Well, John, thank you very much for joining me on this podcast.
Neil, great to be here. Well, I am here actually. This is the garage.
Yeah, we're in your office, so thank you for having us. You have had such an incredible career in the creative and advertising industry, such an impact on so many people. I thought what I'd like to do first is actually just start off with your kind of original journey into the industry. And I read somewhere that you were actually wanting to be an artist at first.
I did. I went to art school. I went to Hornsey College of Art. It doesn't quite exist now. It's part of Middlesex, as it's now called. I genuinely thought I wanted to be the next Picasso.
Okay.
Which is not, always think big, I thought, and I basically, I suppose I went to art school because the girls were much prettier, and I thought that would be a great place to be. That sounds a bit sort of shallow, but I can assure you sometimes you make decisions on for very shallow reasons, but they can still be profound. But I loved it. I loved art. I loved kind of the process. And to this day, I can remember walking into the art school for the very first time and the smell of oil paint. And that smell to this day gets me right back to that moment I walked into Hornsey College of Art.
Do you still paint at all today?
No, but I went to art school, and I had a wonderful teacher there who said to me, "John, I don't think you're going to be the next Picasso." Then he quite said it like that, but you love ideas. Why don't you go and study design? So I thought, well, that's a good idea. But he said the place to do that is the London College of Printing, the LCP that was then in Back Hill, Clerkenwell. But then it moved to the Elephant and Castle. So I went there to study design. And it was interesting, actually. And I thought, I love design, but I found all the designers wanted to kind of go back and be artists rather than deal with, I thought, ideas. And I've always loved ideas. Ideas are the thing that really turned me on. And I was talking about the idea, they were talking about shades of blue, or should the type be ranged left, or should be sans serif versus serif, and all those things are great, but I thought, well, yeah, but so what's the idea? And it was whilst I was at design school that a wonderful teacher called John Gillard showed us all the great work coming out of New York, done by Dordan Bernbach, and suddenly you looked at ideas in advertising as being smart, clever, witty, intelligent, but yet inclusive. And it was like a light bulb going on. I went, bang, that's it. That's what I want to do. And, you have to get lucky in life, don't you? And you kind of think, oh, I'm quite good at this. I seem to be quite good at it. Produced a portfolio of advertising ideas. Never graduated from the LCP in a sense.
Right, okay.
Because they were only interested in design. Advertising was seen as, supping with the devil, and but got into advertising in 1965. It's a long time ago, isn't it? I would say it was when the Beatles were releasing Help. It sounds much more interesting when you do that.
I read somewhere though that then you, after 18 months in your first advertising job, you actually got fired from that. So that was almost a very short-lived career.
It's a very short career in advertising. 18 months, all that time but it was. I got this job at Benson and Bowles, and it was very interesting. There's a lesson there. So there I was. I came out of art school, design school, 1965, an advertising portfolio. I thought great ideas. I got 2 job offers. I got a job offer from Young and Rubicam, and that was for sort of £1,000 a year, which actually was a lot of money back then for a starting, £20 a week. And the other job offer I got was from an agency called Benson and Bowles. Doesn't exist anymore. Both big American agencies. And a friend of mine who was in the business was in the business, and I said to him, I've got this dilemma. I've had these 2 job offers. One, Y&R, which is actually going to offer me $1,000 a year, and Benson and Bowles, which is I'm going to get half that. Mm-hmm. And I kind of thought, well, what should I do? And this friend of mine said, well, do you know something, John? I would go for the Benson and Bowles job. I know it's only half the money, but a very, very interesting creative director has come over from New York. And I think it would be fantastic to work with that person rather than just take the money. And I did. I took his advice. It was half the money. But actually, that was one of the best and first lessons in my career. Don't follow the money. Follow the opportunity. And because I did that, I was there for about 2 weeks, and the creative director came to see me and said, yes, we need to find a writer for you, don't we? Because I was an art director. And he said, I found somebody I'd like you to work with. He's starting in the business like you. And I said, oh yeah, what's his name? And he said, oh, it's Charles Saatchi. And I went, oh God, Charles Saatchi. Oh, he's obviously Italian. He lives at home with mum and he can't spell. God, that's just my bloody luck, isn't it? But anyway, eventually Charles joins and we work together. Of course, I was right on two fronts.
Okay.
He did live at home with mum, and he wasn't very good at spelling, but of course he wasn't Italian. But he was a brilliant writer. And so that was
a very chance.
That was a great chance. Now, had I followed the money, I wouldn't have met Charles. Because I followed the opportunity, it so happens I met Charles, and that changed all kinds of things in my life. So
that's incredible. Oh, it's funny. I had a phrase for myself which I thought I'd coined, but I subsequently learned apparently Steve Jobs said it, but connecting the dots. And really for me, it's that notion that looking back, I can see all the dots, all the paths, all the decisions that got me to what I'm doing today. Having tried to work that out from the start, you could never have kind of mapped that out. In fact, often an example I give is meeting you. Yeah. We met at the Decoded London Fashion Summit. I almost didn't speak at that event because I'd spoken the year before, and then decided, I'll go and do it. It's probably a good opportunity. We would never have met. The thing I've learned is you sort of say, and I constantly say it to people, is do interesting things, and interesting things will happen to you. And I think one of the great lessons is, you can't. How do you know how to connect the dots? You've just got no idea. So, what you've got to do is, and I've just said it, but I'll say it again, is follow the opportunity, and in that way, at least you'll be connecting with interesting people. You'll be working on interesting projects. Hopefully, if you just follow the money, eventually, you'll have probably a very short career in advertising or any creative career. Or it's funny how the luckiest people work the hardest.
Exactly.
You put yourself there and have the opportunities. And of course, 10 of the opportunities are terrible and don't work out. But the 11th one, which was your 11th because you kept going.
Is the one that actually happens. Yeah, very much so.
So where did you, what happened after that first role in
Well,
advertising for you?
I then, I got fired because I was a gobby art director, 22 years old or something. And I kind of, in a way, I was a generation that came into advertising because we loved it. It was actually at that time full of people who didn't really particularly love it. They wanted to be an author, or they wanted to be a painter, or they wanted to be something else in the creative world, and advertising just kept them employed. We came into the industry because we actually genuinely loved it. We looked at what was happening in New York.
What did you love? I
loved the fact that it was the communications industry. I love the fact that it gave you a fantastic canvas. The opportunity, there I was, thinking I was going to be a painter, and, you might have done 10 canvases and put an exhibition up somewhere and got, 1,000 people to see it. Instead of that, you work in advertising and somebody comes along and says, well, we've got these 48 sheet posters, those big ones, and we want you to put an idea up there and millions of people are going to see it. And I think all creative people are egoists at heart. Because you are. You've got something to say. You want to say it. And I think advertising gives you a tremendous opportunity to do that. Of course, there are downsides to it. Of course, you're working to a client's brief. But that everybody's working to a brief in some sense or another. Yours is just very obvious. This is the brief, say that. And finding a way of saying it that's interesting and distinctive and putting it up in front of millions of people is a huge turn on. I have to tell you, it's wonderful. It gives you a fantastic feeling. I always remember I had this, and people always talk about research and stuff like that. Sorry, and my research was I had an auntie in Harpenden,
Mm-hmm.
And my auntie in Harpenden was always the one that said to me things like, you know, when the Hovis campaign came out, that wonderful ad about the kid taking his bike up the hill, very famous, you know, the music, you can still hear the music now. And she said, John, did you do that Hovis ad? But that's really good. And I said, no, actually, I didn't really. But she was the most wonderful one. I always just say, if she loved it, it was right on. But it was that lovely thing of kind of, you know, talking to the people. And I think that's the great thing about advertising. It talks to the people. And I think great entertainment, great art talks to the people. It's very easy to do something which is esoteric and you don't get it and you don't understand it. But I think, you know, going back to my love of Picasso, I actually do think he was a daring artist, very, very daring. But actually his work did, in the end, talk to people. They got it, they understood it. And I think that's a brilliant quality. It's like with movies, you know. Great movies are ones that not only have a depth and character to them, but they talk to the people.
Yep, and they can associate with it. Out of interest, what was the first ad that you worked on that your auntie was then ecstatic about?
Well, I did an ad for, it's the mid-70s before I got the stamp of approval from my auntie, so it was 10 years into my career. And we did this wonderful little ad for Johnson & Johnson, and it was for cotton buds. And we created a little character called Johnson Jr. who told people about cotton buds. And he told adults off because, you know, they weren't cleaning their important little places correctly. And it was a wonderful little ad, got a silver at D&AD. And she saw it and she thought that's really. Did you do the drawings? Well, actually, no, I didn't do the drawings. So what did you do in it then, John? Well, I came up with the idea. What do you mean you came up with the idea? And it was lovely, but she loved that. She thought that was great. That was it. So my career was off and running as far as she was concerned.
Perfect. And so then let's talk about the early. I've dug out this picture from the early days at Saatchi and Saatchi. I thought we did.
Oh, shocking! Yeah,
your hairstyle's okay in that one.
Oh, that's not too bad. Hair. That's the big. You always have to remember hair. Charlie does look like a bit like a thug, doesn't he? That was wonderful.
It's definitely his gang. So how did that come about, and what was that like?
Well, it was a brilliant moment in life. I mean, what happened was Charlie left. We worked for about a year and a half at Benson and Bowles. Then he left and worked with a wonderful art director called Ross Kramer, and they went to Collett Dickinson Pierce, which was a phenomenal agency. And I've always said there are only actually two great agencies in the world. One was Dordan Bernbach because they invented modern advertising. They invented the way of talking to people as though they were intelligent, but yet could be embraced with kind of openness and kind of warmth and wit and humour and all those wonderful things. And then there was Collett Dickinson Pierce, which was a British agency that most people have forgotten now. But what Collett's did is that they took creativity to the masses. So they did Heineken refreshes the past other beers cannot reach. They did Hovis. They did Fiat Strada. They did phenomenal campaigns that were national campaigns. They weren't little campaigns that ran in some esoteric magazine. They were kind of talking to the nation. So what they did was that they showed that creativity worked better than anything else if you were trying to engage with people. Now, in advertising, that was not seen as the case. I mean, obviously, everybody else in the world of engagement understood that. Artists understood that. Television program makers understood that. Filmmakers understood that. But the world of advertising didn't. And Collett's did that. They took creativity to the masses. So it was a very exciting time to be around. And then we had Charlie had then left Collett's and wanted to set up a consultancy where they could work with any number of people. And he asked me to join them, and it was called Kramer Saatchi Consultancy in 1967. And we did that for about 3 years. And then realised...
Did you have any hesitation in going in?
Not at all. I mean, it was just a brilliant opportunity. And again, because it was like, this was creative people taking control. And one thing I would say today, and referring this back to today, is that I think the great leaps in our industry have always been made when creative people have taken control. And I think they're not taking control today. They've stood back. They're kind of not sure of themselves, and they need to assert themselves and the creative process. And that's what we were doing back then. We were kind of taking control, saying creative people have got to make a difference and are making a difference. And so we started the consultancy. The consultancy was great. The only danger in a consultancy is that you kind of end up, literally we worked out we had to do a great campaign every week because the amount we were being paid,
Right.
kind of, that's how it worked. And it was just relentless. The pressure was relentless. It was great. We enjoyed it. We did some wonderfully mad things. But in the end, you wanted to develop a relationship with a brand so that you could really encourage them to kind of do braver things, get things done better, make sure they were working well. And from that, we realized we had to be an agency. And so in 1970, we decided to be an agency.
There's an interesting point there, though, because we've talked previously about the pressure and time and speed of things, and one of the points that you've made to me in the past was around this idea that, we'd rush, you would invest an awful lot in a half good idea. Why not just wait a week longer and it might be an amazing idea with such a better result?
Yeah.
But that's kind of a paradox when there is that pressure of delivery all the time, especially today with all these channels that people have to put content out through. So how do you think it's still possible to deliver? Is that why you think creative people aren't taking control?
I think I think that's partly the reason. I think that they've been told they've got to have it faster, and I understand that. I mean, how can we get to the issues that we want to get to quicker and with more kind of understanding and greater depth? But actually, I used to say to clients, look, I can give you an idea tomorrow, but I can give you a great idea in a week's time. What do you want? I'll give you an idea tomorrow. I can do one in 15 minutes if you want. Is it a great idea? Do you want to invest all that money behind it? And I think we've failed to get people to understand that actually, yes, we can cut down various timings in things. We can cut process out. We can cut bureaucracy out of the system so that we get to the essence of what we're trying to do much faster. But actually, the human brain does not work any faster, despite the fact that we've invented digital technology. It still takes time. And that we're not arguing for that. We're not making that case to clients that wouldn't you want a great idea as opposed to a half good idea? And of course, they hear you saying that and they say, no, I want it tomorrow. And that's because the industry is not being driven by creative people. It's being driven by account people or people who are about the process, or they're technologists. So I can make the technology work faster. A car engineer can make the car go faster and faster and faster. Yeah, but the human brain is not going faster and faster and faster, despite what everybody thinks. So we've got to argue, and it's because creative people are not taking control and coming back and saying, no, that's how long it takes an idea to happen. And I was like, I always say to people, I do my best thinking when I'm not thinking. And you take all the influences, you take all the brief in, you talk about what you're doing, then you're walking down the road, and suddenly the idea pops in. And they're brilliant ideas that still resonate today, that have value today. I mean, one of the things in our industry, we talk about Apple and we talk about their great commercial 1984. Mm-hmm. I mean, it ran once. Really? But its influence has been phenomenal as a return on investment. Isn't that incredible that they actually, there's a whole story about why it only ran once, but we don't need to go there at this moment. But that's the value of creativity. That's the value of being patient, of getting the right idea, of making sure it's great. It was fascinating actually, because I was talking to somebody in the I won't say which car brand it was, and he was sort of talking about what it's like now working in car marketing, and he said, we've got to be on all the time. We've got to be ideas. We've got to have ideas all the time. And I kind of I sort of sat there thinking, why? Why do you have to be on all the time? Do you? Who said you have to be on all the time? Just because you can put stuff out there all the time doesn't mean to say you should. Is it better? Why don't you spend a bit more time putting stuff out there that's great? Do you have to have it on all the time? And it's this weird, we get into these kind of mantras where people say, oh, no, you've got to be on all the time. Yes, you've got to be on. Oh, the world wants you to be on all the time. It's absolutely essential. Constantly transmitting. And we're just creating noise. It's just noise out there that people are just getting aggravated with.
But then I guess that leads me on to a question that's got two parts to it. So one is also something that we've always talked about is your concept of principles always remain the same, practices change. Which I think is what you're trying to underline and say here with the notion of it's got to be creative and actually take the time to produce something great. But I guess in the practices change bit, then I'd be interested in your thoughts on, in particular, the impact of social media on advertising creativity, because to a degree that's creating the channels through which this noise exists, but also it is creating channels that brands have to play in and be a part of and communicate through. I mean, in your mindset, how has social media changed advertising and creativity?
Well, I keep saying that this is possibly the most exciting time to be in the communications industry. I think it's fantastic, absolutely brilliant.
And actually, it's interesting that you say communications industry.
Yeah, I do.
That in itself is an umbrella that actually maybe people need to remember.
I do. I think, if you talk about advertising, that's one part of it. I've never kind of, I've always said to people, like, I work in advertising, I don't live in advertising. And I actually, whenever I've created work, I never thought about it as advertising. I've always thought about it as great communication, something that people want to talk about. And I think great creative people, saying this as I'm great, but I think really outstanding creative people, when they're sitting down doing something, when you're writing a book or painting a picture or making a film, you're doing something bigger than just writing a book. You want it to be bigger than that. You don't want to be just a book. So, J.K. Rowling writes Harry Potter, and she's created something that's much bigger than a book. It's a kind of way of being. It's an attitude. It's a point of view. It's a sort of whole world that she's created. And that's what you're trying to do. So, you're a filmmaker, you're making a movie, you're making something bigger than just a movie, you're making a statement about something. So I think you're trying to live beyond what it is that you're doing. You're trying to live beyond just a piece of advertising. So I try and talk about it as the communications industry, because I'm trying to talk to you, and I'd love you to listen. And I think you listen because I've inspired you, or you watch because I've inspired you. So I think today it's a phenomenal time to be in the industry. But, as I say, principles remain, practices change. I mean, the advertising industry was changed dramatically by the development of television. Television was the most phenomenal piece of technology that came along that suddenly went, wow. Essentially, people would go out to the cinema to see a movie. I could now have the movie in my home. This is absolutely incredible. We forget that because it's been around us now for so long. So I think you've always got developments, technology developing and giving and creating opportunities. And it's like I say, technology enables opportunity. It's actually creativity that creates value. And I think that's the way you've got to view it. It's kind of, how am I talking to people? Where am I going to talk to them? How am I going to command their attention? Is a kind of a really fascinating debate today. Where do you start this conversation? How do I start the conversation? What am I going to start it with? Am I going to do something that people want to listen to as opposed to ram it down their throat? Am I going to engage and entertain them? And I think that's why I feel today is such an exciting time to be around, and how you can follow it through. I mean, when I, obviously came into the industry, and for a huge amount of time, you kind of had an idea, you put it out there, and you hoped that it got picked up. Well, now, I mean, I can play all kinds of games of putting an idea out there, engaging people in this particular platform or that particular platform, and I think that's phenomenal. But it still requires a fabulous idea. I sort of always think about, I try, when I'm thinking about the communications industry, I stop thinking about the communications industry and I think about the film industry. Well, how does the film industry do it? That's another creative industry. And what they do is they go, let's create a great movie, and then let's put it out there, let's seed it here, let's get that actor involved in it, let's use all the channels we can to get people talking about it. But ultimately what they do is they start with a great movie. And I think in terms of our industry, I think the Bond franchise is one that we should almost use as an example of kind of how it should be. So there you are. You've got this movies which came from books. 007, License to Kill. It's got the same end line actually, as it had in 1962, I think, was the first one, Dr. No. But what they do is that they constantly refresh it. They constantly get That's different Bond now. We're going to get a better script. We're going to do it like this. Essentially, the structure is exactly the same, but they constantly refresh it. They put a new piece of music in. They keep the title music exactly the same. And I think it's a wonderful example of how you work at something that has got real engagement with it, but you get it better and better and better and better. So we're in a situation now where, people are talking about, will Daniel Craig do another Bond movie because he's so brilliant at it? And the franchise today is worth billions, much, much more than it was, back in 1962, but they've stayed with it. And they use all the kind of tools at their disposal to kept it relevant and keep it relevant. But they're not on all the time, and there's an anticipation, it's coming out. And I think it's a great, I love that for me, it's a great example of how the communications industry should perhaps think.
But I guess you can see how it can be overwhelming for people with all the channels to pick through. I mean, let's say, we'll come on to what you're doing today with the garage, but let's say you were starting a brand today and you've got that great idea. How would you look at, I guess, there's cutting up the different communication channels. And I think one of the interesting things, there's all this thing about digital, is also there's all that audience segmenting and stuff, and then people feel the pressure around all the data and all the audience segmentation to serve the right communication piece to people. And I just wonder sometimes, is all of that necessary? Do we get too bogged down in the data? And people remember that advertising is persuasion, which is another big thing we're always pushing for.
Yeah, first of all, I think data's always been important. It's to say that it's not is be stupid. After all, the Doomsday Book was data collection, wasn't it? He wanted to go around and find out what the kingdom had, so he went around. So I think data's always been part of history. Really, it's always been there. But I think I've always said, actually, that the other reason I really love what's happening today is that I always argued, and I'll talk about advertising, for advertising. Now, a lot of people argue against it and say, it doesn't encourage competition, it's a rich man's club. And I always used to argue, but advertising is great because it is one of our freedoms. You've had an idea, I want to take that idea to people and tell them about it. That's a freedom. No, let's forget it. There's not much advertising in North Korea. The criticism against that was, but it's a rich man's club. It costs a huge amount of money. So actually, it excludes people from getting in. It's much harder to get in. Now, Ripple Dissolve today. And I think the brilliant thing today is how you can have an idea for a product, which is why I think there's so much dynamism around. You can have an idea for a brand, a product, whatever it might be, and you can find an audience very, very quickly. And you can establish the value of that brand. I think that's where the digital world has been absolutely incredible, and that's why I love it. But like all those things, there comes a moment when you have to start going, right, now I've got a core audience, but how do I grow this brand? How do I make it more and more important and more valuable? We talk about research, and research, is interesting. It can tell you all kinds of things, but it should be just another voice in the room. Sadly, it becomes the most important voice in the room, and therefore it takes preeminence over everything else. And I think that's what's happening with data. The same thing is that people are just looking at the data because they want certainty. I completely understand that. Who wouldn't? In some ways you think, that would be great, but actually life is an adventure.
Yep.
And a brand has got to view it that way. Unless it does that, it's going to find itself being kind of narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower. And in the end, it's not talking to a broad audience, and it doesn't have the value it should have.
So it's just going to limit people.
Yeah.
You think that's one of the main things being missed?
Totally. I think it again, I go back to my thing. It's because, look at the most interesting companies around at the moment. I know that we keep talking about Apple, but it is remarkable. It's just absolutely remarkable. A brand that has been built on no research whatsoever, just go out and try things, do things. Now, I know they're in technology. I know they understand. I understand all of that. But actually, Nike are the same. Nike don't do research. They do things. They put it out there and they go, right, try it. let's see if this works. If it works, we'll follow it. And I think that's a much more dynamic way of working. Now, you can say to me, John, that's a bit irresponsible. I don't think it is. I think you've got to kind of accept that this is what the future of marketing is going to be like. I have an interesting... I think actually all marketing in the end is fashion. I think all brands are fashion.
Okay.
And I think we're now in a world where everything's fashion. You know, the food you eat, the place you go on holiday, where I live, the clothes I buy, the car I drive, fashion.
Tells the story of you.
Yeah. And I think, you know, because why? Because, well, do we need another car? Do we need another type of soup? Do we need another place to go on holiday? No, it becomes fashion. And I think if you look at the world of fashion, what they do is they create kind of clothes, they create looks, they create styles, they put it out there, see which one gets picked up, and they go with it and they follow it. They do their catwalk, they put it out, they get people looking at it, and they kind of sense things, try things. And I think there's not enough of that in our industry right now. Try stuff, just do it, see what captures, see, and don't worry, be daring, be different. Because, you know, I think the danger of data, and this is the big danger of data, is, and our ex-chairman, Jim Carroll, did a wonderful talk on it, and it's called wind tunnel marketing. And what he said was, because everybody will have access to the same data at the same time, in the same way, you'll all end up with the same conclusion. Unlike, you know, cars in the 80s, they were wind tunnel designed. They all started looking the same. They put them in the same, you know, the wind was the same, instead of it being different. And the point of a competitive economy is you create difference.
Yep.
Because, you know what, you know, if it's all the same, why have three of them? I mean, I'll just have one, you know. So you're looking at kind of, you know, the danger of data just driving you to being similar as opposed to difference. And if you look at, say, someone like Apple, I mean, coming up with the iPhone, and that was a creative act. Somebody sat down and said, all that technology was out there. Nokia could have done it.
Yep.
There was nothing new about it, but somebody thought creatively and thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if you had a big screen? Because then you could do this, you could do that, and bang, you've got the iPhone. And that sort of daringness has got to be a part of what a brand does. If it doesn't do it, then it'll just be, you know, it's no, you know,
middle of the road.
Middle of the road. And this lovely phrase, a number of times I've worked with people who said, yes, we want to be a brand leader. We want to be the brand leader. And you go, oh, that's great, good ambition, you know. So only two words there, brand. Are you a brand? You know, have you got some assets around you? And are you leading? And you generally find people go, well, we are a brand, but are we leading? And you generally find they're following. So you say to them, oh, I see, so you're a brand follower. That's fine, okay, if that's what you want to be, but admit to it.
It's back to your point of creatives taking control to a degree.
I think I can't go on enough about that, and I really feel this very powerfully.
But that's for innovation.
Yeah.
And the irony is that today, through digital, through social, the ability to broadcast is potentially easier and lower cost than ever before.
Yeah.
But perhaps the broadcast bit has slightly got missed because they're going after all the data in these niche audiences. I
mean, if you think about great art, and if you think about great communication, what it does, it unifies people.
Yeah.
You know, somebody said something wonderful to me the other day. You know, Picasso never had a business plan. He just painted great pictures, and people went, "Oh, that's a great picture. That's really good. I like that." But I think, you know, you don't sort of go, you know, I'm gonna, you know, Matisse didn't sort of start painting pictures. Think, people like blue a lot. I think I'll put a bit of blue in there. Maybe a bit of yellow with the blue might be quite good. I've got some research that says me a bit of yellow with the blue works quite well. They did something they believed in, and people went, you know, that's fantastic. I love that. Or a movie, you know, same thing.
See your influences of art on everything.
Well, yeah. Well, I think, you know, I think if you, as I say, you know, I work in advertising. I don't live in advertising. I try and bring the world outside into what I do here, because I want to live beyond just creating a piece of advertising.
So now you've working with your own setup called The Garage, where you're looking at startups. Spoiler alert, you've also invested in Whalar as well, which we're very pleased to have you on board.
Pleased to be on board.
What is it that excites you at The Garage? What do you look for in brands? Why are you doing this?
Well, why am I doing it? That's the I've always loved the idea of creating things. I've always loved the idea of, you know, when you're sort of having an idea, you're starting with a blank page. There's nothing there. And you have an idea, and that idea, you create an idea, you create an entity, and you then make that entity. You see it grow, you see it develop, you see people being able to relate to it. I find that very exciting. So seeing and helping businesses grow, I think, is very exciting. Because I think ultimately business is creative. Because you start with something, you have an idea, and you try and create that idea, you make that idea come to life, and then you've got to communicate it to the world outside. So that's what we're doing here, and you're connected. I love the idea of being connected, because we don't sort of say we're only dealing with technology, or we're only dealing with media, or it's anything, anything that we think is an interesting idea. So how do we judge it? Well, we kind of go, first of all, do we think, and I know, this is a kind of word that everybody uses, is it disrupting a current business model? But I quite like that. Great ideas are disruptive. Great creativity is disruptive. It's always been like that. So is it doing that? Is it monetizable? Because, it's amazing that the people who come in with ideas and you go, how are you going to make money out of that? Oh, don't know. Well, that, is quite, an interesting point. You've got to have to make money. You've got to be able to feed the business. Is it scalable? Because, I'm interested in scale, having come from the world of broadcast advertising. I love the fact that it gets big. I don't view big as bad. I view big as interesting. I want to do a big movie, a big idea, a big, big is good. Don't think it's bad. And then, do you like the people? And you can take any one of those kind of methods of measuring the business. But I think ultimately, do you like the people is the most important, because you're going to work with them and it might fail. Yeah, there's a very good chance it's going to fail. I'm told in this world that, you back 10 ideas and 8 fail and one makes reasonable money, but the other one makes a fortune. But that's what excites me. That's why I'm here doing this at the garage, and I love it. And what we try and say to people is, look, don't start a business, build a brand, because that's where value is going to lie. And that's how you resist competitive pressure. Because whatever idea you've got, somebody else will come along, they'll copy it, they'll develop a bit of technology that's very similar to yours, So build the brand, understand why a brand is important, and invest in that. And that's what we try and help and guide people to do.
And that's because that brand ultimately becomes the communication piece. Because I always say to people that there are many people out there probably that have developed an amazing product, but it doesn't sell and doesn't get traction because you have to put as much work and love and care and attention into building the product as you do into the, I guess your word would be the brand, mine would be the communication strategy. Yeah. And you're just saying that is underpinned because the brand conveys everything that the product
Well, a brand is bigger than just the communication. The brand is the belief in what it is you're making, how you make it, where you make it, why you think it's right. I mean, it's got all sorts of things, and all of those things are then translated into your communication program. So your fundamental belief in what it is about, what are you trying to create here? And I think in a way, again, I may use all sorts of analogies, but I think about it like a religion. You're creating a belief system. Why should I, why do I believe in Audi versus BMW or Jaguar or Mercedes or whatever it might be? You're creating a belief system.
So I want to ask the question, how do brands get it right? But I'd actually rather ask the question, how do people get it wrong?
Well, wrong is always very interesting. It's very funny, actually. I always say that people say to me creatively, they say, what have you learned from your mistakes? And I say, nothing.
Okay.
Absolutely nothing. Don't dwell on your mistakes if you're a creative person, because what you're trying to do all the time is you're trying to break borders, barriers. You're trying to do something different, daring, whatever it is. And if it fails, you're then kind of like, oh my God, it failed. I better go back.
Don't take the risk again.
Yeah, I won't take that risk again. And that's hugely dangerous. I mean, film directors have that problem. They make a movie, huge success, and wow, you've done fantastically well here. They do their second movie, flop. That happens all the time. So what do? Do they go, oh, blimey, I better go back and do what I did before because that succeeded? Or do they go, nope, forget it, move forward? Right. But I think with a business, you can look at failures because there is a process in a business. You can understand that looking at what you've done before that didn't work, you might be able to take that forward into how you create something great again. And I think, when I look at failures in business, I think the biggest failure, I mean, there are lots of ways of looking at it, but I think the biggest is not daring to be different. And, following what other people have done. Now, to a certain extent, you can argue that there's a huge business in following what other people have done. I mean, Henry Ford would say, I never wanted to be first. I always wanted to be second. Let somebody else make the mistakes. But I think today, in a hugely competitive world, getting noticed is the most important thing you've got to do. Because, it's like I say about, why I think broadcasters work. It's like you're in a train, the train's gone into a tunnel and you're winking at the girl opposite you. You're the only one who knows who's doing it. She doesn't know you're doing it. So you've got to find a way of letting the world know, this is what I believe in. That's why broadcast is crucially important, why it's important to tell people what you're doing. And you've got to find a way of being different and stand out. And again, I look at fashion does that. Why was Alexander McQueen so amazing? I mean, people didn't walk around with a strange headgear he put into his shows, but he was showing you how different he was. He wasn't like everybody else. And so therefore you noticed him. You noticed what he was doing. And I think brands have got to do that. Dare to be different.
With what you've seen from your involvement in startups now, what do you think the larger, more established brands can learn from these startups that are disrupting and gaining large market share?
I think the thing that they can learn is don't be afraid of trying something different. And I think, we've talked about this a lot, about how I think in today's world, funny enough, 20 years ago, the big brands had the advantage because they had the money and they had the influence, and they were like these sort of, massive organizations that could steamroll or anything. They could buy their way into markets and that. And I think the younger, nimbler, smarter, sharper brands are the ones that have the advantage today. And I think, remember, you've got that advantage over the large brands because they're slow, they're bureaucratic, they're worried about, doing something different. It might affect their bottom line and all that. And so, that's why they buy big brands, buy small brands.
Yep.
I'm always stunned, when Cadbury's bought Green and Blacks. I mean, I thought, wait a minute, you make chocolate. Why have you bought another chocolate company? Why didn't you do it? They couldn't. They didn't have the ability.
It's just one of taking more risks, being more acceptive of. Yeah.
So they don't adopt risk.
The irony is if they did, startups would have a really tough time.
Exactly.
If big brands started behaving more like it, there'd be so much less opportunity.
But it will never happen. So, it'll never happen.
From a startup position, I hope not.
Absolutely. Don't worry about it. It will never happen.
So within the communication industry, we're going to use that word now. What excites you about what's coming next?
Well, I think the thing that really excites me about the industry today is opportunity. I think there's huge opportunity out there. I think it's wide open. I think the opportunity to create really distinctive work is there. Nobody's really grabbing it. Just when I came into the industry, the advertising was very boring. And when people started doing interesting advertising, people started looking at it. It became a part of culture. People started talking about it and wanting to be a part of it. So I think today it's about opportunity, and it doesn't require vast amounts of money. That's the other thing. What it requires is daring, creativity, commitment, belief, all of those things,
and maybe some relaxation of data and metrics
to
remember.
Put those on.
Look at them.
Look at them. They're there. Why not? But be prepared to challenge them.
Broadcast
your idea.
And then let's finish up on the question part with what one piece of advice would you now give to someone starting off their career in the communication industry?
Well, it's the piece of advice I would give them is how I got my first job and why I went for my first job, which is never follow the money.
Yep. Opportunity.
Money's a tool, not a philosophy. Remember that.
Great. Perfect. Well, what we finish on now is our quick fire round. So these are the ones you're not allowed to think about.
You're not allowed to think about.
We want your instant answers. We can't wait a week for a better answer. It's the straight off the top of your head.
Go for it.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Best business book you've read?
The best business book I've read is, and it's not necessarily a business book, it's how to write for television, is William Goldman, Adventures of the Screen Trade.
Okay.
Fantastic book.
One for everyone to read. Name someone who's inspired you the most.
Bill Bernbach.
Okay. Your favourite band.
Oh, God, this is so fucking difficult. Do I go to the Beatles or do I go to the Rolling Stones? And I think in the end, I think the Beatles.
The Beatles. Favourite movie.
Favourite me, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Okay. If you weren't working this I think I know the answer. If you weren't working in this industry, what would you be doing?
Well,
Painting?
funny enough, actually, I love architecture.
Okay.
Yeah, I love architecture. I love it. I think it's brilliant. Building something that, it's an idea and it stands there. It's like sculpture. It's sort of, people walk in here, relate to it. I love it. Architecture's fantastic.
It's that idea of creating something. Yeah. What's one tiny thing that annoys you the most?
Queuing.
Queuing. If you had a time machine, when and where would you go?
Right now.
Good answer. If you were running for office, what would your campaign slogan be?
Don't believe in everything. Don't believe in things that everybody tells you.
Okay. And then final question, beluga, blue, humpback or killer whale?
I suppose, I have to go for the killer whale, don't I? It's evolved. It's the most perfect machine. It's never going to change. It's there, It's fantastically efficient.
Fair enough. Great. Thanks, John. Appreciate your time. It's been fantastic talking to you.
Wonderful, Neil. Fantastic.
Thanks for listening to the Whalar Podcast. Be sure to check out the next episode where I'm chatting to Juan Penvidis, the Global Head of Creative and Media at Nestle.